Welcome to the International Women's Day webinar. This is our second annual one here at the Greensboro History Museum. My name is Sarah M. Mask, and I am the Public Programs Coordinator here at the museum. And I'm really excited to have our two guests today who are going to be talking about nursing history, not only in the Triad, but in North Carolina overall. So International Women's Day is a day that we celebrate that's been around for over 100 years now, celebrating the accomplishments of women throughout the world. And what better way to celebrate than talk about nursing history today? And we have our moderator for today is Ann Brown. She is a Greensboro native that has been here for over 30 years. And she is a UNCG alumni, receiving her BSN, MSN, and DNP from UNCG. And Ann also retired after 25 years from Cone Health in various roles, whether it's in intensive care, cardiovascular for nursing, or even administration roles within Cone Health. And we're really excited to have our speaker for today, Phoebe Pollitt. Dr. Pollitt was a public nurse and a nursing educator and historian for over 45 years in Durham and the Watauga counties. And she has done extensive research on nursing history in the state over the last couple of years. She's written over 40 or 75 articles and 4 books about North Carolina nurses, and she maintains the North Carolina Nursing History website that is on App State, and we'll add that link into our chat in just a couple minutes. Please stay on the line, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please throw it into the chat. I'll collect those and we'll talk about them after our discussion between Ann and Phoebe. I will turn that over to you now. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I appreciate being here today. And Phoebe, it is such an honor to be talking to you, since I've certainly read your research as a student and even used it as a nursing leader, and you have contributed such a body of knowledge to nursing, not only in our state, but nationally. So I just am honored to be here today. And just to set some context for our audience, Sarah had asked us to focus really on the early 1900s. So Phoebe, let's start there. How would you describe the state of healthcare in the state of North Carolina back in the 1990s? Or excuse me, 1900s.
Great, thanks. First, I wanted to thank Sarah and the Greensboro History Museum for allowing us to do this program. And it's been really nice meeting you, Ann, and for our conversations the last few weeks. So I'm super glad to be here and talk about nurses. Maybe we can flip the slides on while I'm talking. North Carolina, Greensboro and the cities were a little more advanced. I live up in Boone and in Appalachia, and the state progressed really unevenly, but for most of North Carolina, most people who lived in North Carolina, rural life in the early 1900s was pretty bleak. There was, of course, no electricity, no public water or sewer systems, no phones, of course, no internet, no radio or television, very few paved roads. In terms of healthcare, there were some hospitals in the city and a few scattered about, but many people lived quite a distance. And then up here in the mountains, you throw in winter weather and no paved roads, and hospital care was often just not part of people's lives or consciousness. There was no regulation of medicines at that time. So I think in a slide or two, you'll see there's a lot of quack medicines, and even, do you mind flipping some slides? Here's a picture. This was from Banner Elk, North Carolina. We didn't get electricity up here till after World War II. Some of the Boone City had it, and Banner Elk City, they had water, hydropower. But out in the counties, it was the Rural Electrification Administration in the 40s after World War II where we got electricity. But even in Banner Elk, this is an operation. They had to wait till there was no electric lighting and not good ventilation. So they had to wait till the weather was suitable, and they would operate outside so they could see and so they could have a breeze to help. And some of these next slides, yeah, that's this first one, the road on the left, that's 1912, and that's the road from Durham to Greensboro. So that's, even in the cities or between the cities. And the one in the middle, if you can't recognize it, that's a well, and on the right is an outhouse. These were the well and outhouse pictures are from Alamance County around 1915. Not to digress from nurses too much, but the state had a great big sanitary privy campaign in the teens and the 20s, which meant building better outhouses. We're not advocating for indoor plumbing because we didn't have many places with city water and sewer, but there was a big campaign to build about how to build and why you should build sanitary privies, not just outhouses. What's the next slide? Oh yeah, back to sort of quackery. We didn't know too much, and didn't know near as much 100 years ago as we now know about the causes of disease and treatments for disease. So people used all kind of remedies that now we would shudder at. And if we go, there's a country doctors museum down near East Carolina, down in that neck of the woods, in Bailey. And this was a pretty exact replica of one of the rural physicians down there. So most physicians concocted their own medicines, but you can imagine that dosing and stability of meds and longevity of meds could be quite a problem, but it was better than the quack medicine. But physicians in their offices or in their homes would have a setup like this and measure and concoct the best they could with what we knew. Of course, this was before penicillin. There was a few medicines, but not the ones we use so commonly now were still yet to be discovered. Okay, next slide. When we think about healthcare in the early 1900s, we know the leading cause of death was tuberculosis and other pulmonary diseases, primarily tuberculosis. The number one killer was tuberculosis. The second leading cause of death for women was childbirth. And so that was the age of infectious diseases. Now we know it's lifestyle choices that usually get us: smoking and lack of exercise and poor diets and drug and alcohol use, distracted driving. But 100 years ago, it was infectious diseases. And without clean water, and with unsanitary privies, and we didn't know so much about nutrition, and we're cooking over fires and wood stoves mostly, it was easy for germs to spread. So things started changing around the turn of the century. You can see here, I'm not going to read all this, but we started understanding more about vaccine, nutrition. We started getting some effective vaccines against some of the diseases. Unfortunately, during the Civil War, we lost somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 people, mostly to disease, but a lot, with the mini balls and the surgery, they learned a lot about surgery and anesthesia and anatomy, got way better at that than we were before the Civil War. And the importance of sanitation, the germ theory of disease. People before the Civil War pretty much thought disease was God's will, or something about humors, good humors and bad humors. But around the 1880s, the idea that there was actually germs that we couldn't see and that they would cause disease was spreading. We know that Florence Nightingale never believed the germ theory, but she was getting older then.
Well, Phoebe, when you think about the state of nursing back then too, what barriers and challenges, in particular with minority nurses, what did they face back then in trying to take care of their populations?
Oh, and I don't think I have those slides. I'm sorry, I have some slides. The first nursing school in before Florence Nightingale we take as the sort of mother of nursing, and she was British, and she wrote a lot of books, and they found their way over to the United States initially during the Civil War and after. And so some schools in the 1870s were set up on the Nightingale model, which included things like sanitation and hand washing and breezes and cleanliness and quiet and restfulness. And so before that, most nursing was done in the home or on plantations by enslaved women. And it was sort of by hook or crook or what different people felt like. So we got our first nursing school in North Carolina in 1894, which was Rex in Raleigh. But of course, that was for white women only and white women only. But by 86 and 1886, sorry, I'm usually live in the 1800s. St. Augustine College opened St. Agnes Hospital for African-American women. Now, white hospitals and nursing schools proliferated a lot more than African-American ones. Gene Trambarger, was our first male faculty member in North Carolina, who writes nursing history, he says, whenever two doctors came to a town, the first thing they did was open a hospital, and the second thing they did was open a nursing school. And he's not far from right, because nursing students at that point were unpaid labor. So they were learning a trade, but worked very long hours and were poorly paid. Getting back to your question about African Americans, most nursing schools wouldn't accept African Americans, so they couldn't get the kind of training nor sit for the registered nurse exam. Essentially, the first African American women we have who took the Board of Nursing exam was in 1916. So there was quite a gap between when. So if they weren't registered nurses, you needed that RN after your name to get quite a few jobs. And so because there was terrible discrimination in the nursing schools that led to terrible discrimination in employment, besides that, there were, we had quite a handful of African-American hospitals in the state, and they would hire their own graduates. And some of the white hospitals had African, well, they call them colored, wards or wings, but they were usually in either attics or basements, cold, damp basements, usually didn't separate men from women. And they would sometimes hire African-American nurses to work in their colored wards and wings, but they were paid less, had terrible working conditions. So we had education. Oh, you want me to go on?
No, I was going to say, it sounds like it was a very difficult challenge, though, for I think all nurses, but especially our minority nurses, as education was being introduced in our state.
The sad thing was our North Carolina Nurse Association had a whites only clause. So when the Nurse Association formed in 1902, and we're very proud that North Carolina's the first state to pass the Nurse Registration Act. So the first RNs in the country are from North Carolina. So we're very proud of that, but the association was a whites only association, and we're not proud of that.
Well, let's focus in a little bit on Greensboro first. Are there any examples of nurses in Greensboro during that time that made an impact on the community?
The nurse in Greensboro most people think about was named Clara Peck. There she is. Clara Peck, she was born in England, and her family first moved to Pittsburgh, and then her dad had some sort of disease, so they moved down to Greensboro. And I don't think I've ever read what his health, maybe it was just poor health and never got a diagnosis. But she and her husband moved to Greensboro to help with her father. Well, then not long after they moved here, her father died and then her husband died. And at that point she had lost a son, I think, and not long after he was born, but she had two daughters and a widowed mother, and she needed to take care of them. One interesting thing about Clara Peck, well, let's go on. She decided she had gone to college and had a degree in voice, but that wasn't going to pay the bills. But in 1901, a few doctors in Greensboro had gotten together and formed the Greensboro Hospital. You can see here it's pretty short-lived. but she went over to the hospital and asked to be trained. And so it wasn't a formal nursing school, but she worked there, and the doctors taught her how to nurse, what they wanted and what she should be doing. And so she was never a registered nurse, but she nursed. At that point, I forget how old she was. She was born in 1858. So she would have been close to 30, close to 40 when she did her nurse's training. So what she did after the hospital closed in 06 because St. Leo's, which was the big deal hospital in Greensboro for many, many years, some nuns came down from Maryland at some doctors' bequest who had trained it. You had some Greensboro doctors who went to Johns Hopkins Medical School and had worked with this particular order of nuns. And so they came back to Greensboro after their training and then asked I'm sorry, I forget are they orders of nuns? The Sisters of Charity. Anyway, they had contacted the nuns, they had the orders they had worked with up there in Maryland, and they came down and opened St. Leo's, and built a state-of-the-art hospital. So much bigger and much better equipped, and with these trained nurses who really knew what they were doing, and they opened a nursing school. So the Greensboro Hospital closed because of that advent. So Clara is a huge role model for all of us public health nurses, went out in the community and started nursing. And until after World War II, most nurses were employed in private duty anyway, which now we would call home health, but they were hired by families to help. Most people didn't want to go to the hospital. They saw the hospital as a place that people would die in. In fact, when St. Peter's, the Episcopalians opened the first hospital in Charlotte called St. Peter's, and the neighbors came in with shotguns and tried to shoot it up because they didn't want all that contagion in their neighborhood. So in the early years, hospitals were not a positive thing for most people. So Clara did home health. And then when a group of sort of upper class white women got together, as they did in those days, there were a lot of club women, as there still are, who want to do good works. So they formed this District Nurse and Relief Association, and they hired Clara Peck. So she had and she was there to see the sick poor in the city and the county. And they paid her a wage and she didn't do private duty for rich people anymore. She spent the next several decades providing nursing care for the sort of least of these, as the Bible would say. And no one was beneath her. She would she would bathe everybody and change dressings and take care of childbirth, take care of whatever. She was also paid. Yeah, the district nurses also, part of her responsibilities were to be a school nurse. And so she would go into all the schools in Greensboro and check vision and hearing and height and weight and tonsils and try and get the kids anything they needed, depending on what her examination showed. And you can see here within the first 3 years, she had visited 7,750 people. My goodness. But the newspaper was people in Greensboro loved her. I wish I had known her. But she got a lot of good press for what she was doing and a lot of thanks. You can see their noble work. And in fact, she got the name Mother Peck instead of Mrs. Peck or Nurse Peck, because she was a little bit older when she started nursing, and she, I think, just loved on everybody.
And she's pretty amazing. It's almost exhausting hearing all the things that she did, because I don't know how she had time in the day to cover everything that she did, but it's amazing, all the work that she did.
She did. And when the Spanish flu came in 1918, she dropped a lot of what she had done before to work in the emergency hospitals and do home visits. And even right before that, like I mentioned earlier, TB was the leading cause of death. And so she, in the country and the state, and I'm sure in Greensboro, I mean, it was in Boone, but she took a special interest in tuberculosis. It's very contagious. Well, now we have drugs like INH, so it's not so scary. But in the olden days, it was very scary because one person would get it, and oftentimes the whole family would get it. and they didn't have they had no medicine for it till the 50s, no effective medicine, no cure, and it was airborne. So if you coughed, anybody that was inhaling what you were coughing out could get the disease. We think of it as a lung disease, but it also got in the bones. It was a pretty horrible thing to catch. So she had a big interest in lungs anyway. And then when the Spanish flu came, which is a respiratory disease, she worked they set up all across the state. We set up emergency hospitals. We didn't have so many hospitals to start with, and they were filled very rapidly. So almost like COVID or polio and then COVID, we get a new disease we aren't expecting, and it sweeps through the community, and a lot of people need care, and we do the best we can with what we have. But I think this is actually a picture of the Charlotte Emergency Hospital, but all across, they'd set up tents out in an open space, often in hospital lawns, some of them schoolyards. The schools would be closed during the flu, the worst of the way we closed during COVID, actually. And so they could set up in and outside the schools for emergency care. And I just thought this was interesting because we have talked about African-American nurses, you and I, in our conversations. And here's a report from the Greensboro newspaper. Although I guess it was called A&T way back then, that there were African-American nurses mostly caring for African-Americans in their community. A lot of people didn't want women, particularly of either race, touching men or bathing men of the other race, or even their own race sometimes. So.
Well, Clara Peck certainly did a lot for our community. And Sarah,
There's
Sarah,
one
we
more
have
slide
a
there.
picture. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. Tell us about this one.
Well, she and her district nurse relief committee, they knew that they needed to isolate. The best thing you can do with tuberculosis, people who have it, is rest, sunshine. Now we have drugs, but back then, and isolation, so they didn't spread it. Well, some people had big enough houses or yards they could isolate, almost like COVID. Some people could have a mother-in-law suite or an extra guest room or something. A lot of people don't and didn't, and couldn't isolate in their own homes. They were crowded. So these women got money and I think they bought a house, but it became a rest cottage, and it was 4 bedrooms, and I think then grew to 6 bedrooms. But people saw it was full all the time, and people raved about the good care they got. So it served as an impetus for the town fathers then to pass a bond issue they really supported. They knew that TB was important. And so Claire Peck she was on the committee that helped spread the word and raise the funds and get enthusiasm. But there was a lot of men in Greensboro that kind of took it over and passed the bond issue and built the TB sanatorium in 1922. And you all know, probably everybody who's watching knows, that became the foundings of the community college. But before that, there was big civil rights demonstrations in Greensboro, and they put the TB closed, the sanatorium closed as a TB facility in the 50s, but it was there and in pretty good shape. So they put a lot of the civil rights demonstrators, that was the temporary prison for that. And then later on in the later 60s became the first place at the Guilford Tech Community College.
And Sarah, do we have a picture of Peck Elementary, or I guess these were some more articles about Clara that were in the paper, but I think it's great how we've honored her by naming one of our elementary schools for her, recognizing the great work that she did in our school system. So it's nice to have someone from Greensboro to be recognized in your research, Phoebe.
Oh, yeah.
Let's switch gears a little bit. The Native American population was obviously very important in North Carolina, and the Native Americans had their own healthcare rituals that they practiced, but eventually Congress passed a law forbidding them to use those rituals. So what kind of response did the Native American nurses have to that in trying to meet the needs of their communities?
I'll try and speak more quickly or tell it more briefly. The first Cherokee, Eastern Band Cherokee Indian registered nurse was named Lula Gloin, and we honor her a lot. It's interesting, her dad was Cherokee, her mom was Catawba. So the only language they had in common was English. They'd each been at boarding school and they'd each learning. So English was the home language, which is really rare for Eastern Band Cherokee around the turn of the century. But because the children, the 7 children, were such good English speakers, they all went on to have great careers. But Lula, she went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school in Cherokee. We're not going to talk about Lumbees today. We just don't have there's great Lumbee nurses, but we're going to talk about Cherokee nurses. From there, Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was a college set up by abolitionists after the Civil War for African Americans, for about 20 years had a multicultural program where they also took admitted Native Americans. So Lula went to Hampton. They learned, the girls were mostly there to be teachers and the boys were there to be preachers. But so Lula taught for a year or two, but she really, really wanted to be a nurse. So her teachers at Hampton helped her get up to Chestnut Hill Hospital in Pennsylvania, which she did. Thank heavens they took, great that they took a Native American, a full-blooded Cherokee, well, half Cherokee, half Catawba. Anyway, she did very well there, got a gold medal in the obstetrics part of it. The local Episcopal Church had helped pay her way, so they sent her out to Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. So she nursed for a couple of years with the Sioux. I think it was probably a pretty racist sort of seen one Indian, seen them all. She didn't speak the Sioux language. She didn't know the Sioux customs. It's kind of interesting because it's International Women's Day. And of course, the Koala boundary where the Eastern Band Cherokee live is not international, but it is a separate sovereign nation. So it's a nation within a nation. Anyway, Lula came back. There we have the Congress outlawing Native Americans. You can click through a few more if you want. There she is at the boarding school in Hampton Institute. Click it. Yeah, there she is. So she was out on the Sioux reservation when World War I broke out, and she volunteered. She wanted to go overseas, but failed the seasickness test. So they wouldn't let her go. You had to be on a boat for several weeks. So she ended up being assigned to a fort in Washington State. So she was the only officer. Nurses were entered the Army Nurse Corps as lieutenants. And so she was the only Eastern Band Cherokee officer in World War I. So after the war, she eventually comes back to Cherokee. Cherokee at that time only had a clinic that was served part-time actually on the grounds of the boarding school. And she was like, no, we need a hospital. So she did a lot of public health nursing, just like Claire Peck did. She would go from home to home. She would do childbirth. She would do whatever disease or condition people had that needed a nurse. She would change dressing. She would suture. She talks about, she would go on foot, by horse. We can flip through some slides. She was very active with the Red Cross, and here she is teaching. She would do the health education because the Koala boundary is big. I wish I knew how many miles it was. I don't, but it's big. And she was the only formally trained healthcare provider, except a part-time white physician that would come to the school clinic a few days a week. So the more people knew about how to take care of themselves, the better. So we didn't have CPR then, but she would teach first aid and childcare and sanitation. We can flip again. So she and some other leaders of the tribe went to Washington during the Great Depression. There was a few New Deal programs under President Roosevelt that were just for Native Americans because their conditions were pretty rotten. And they successfully lobbied to get a hospital built. So the first hospital in Cherokee, now there's a great new one that's really, if y'all get a chance to go see it, you should. The eye charts are in, when you do the letters going across, they're in Cherokee and English, and all the signage is in Cherokee and English. But it's pretty. It's very pretty and bright and new. Anyway, so Claire, listen to me. Lula got the first hospital on the Koala boundary going. She was instrumental in doing that. She continued to do her home visits. She spent 40 years after World War I. There she is. She went by horseback. First, she'd had to walk. When she earned enough money, she bought a horse. And eventually, when there was enough paved roads to make it make sense, the government bought her a car. So that was exciting. But for a long time, there weren't good enough roads to even bother with a car. So she retired. She worked till she was 77. So points for that, right? This is her last job was as the supervising home health nurse for the community action program. I actually think she was the nurse for Unto These Hills, the play. And I think she actually was the nurse for the play even longer, but that was a part-time summer kind of job. So she was honored by the North Carolina Nurse Association. She's in our Hall of Fame, but she was also the highest tribute the Eastern Band Cherokee can give is to be a beloved man of the tribe or a beloved woman of the tribe. And she was honored as a beloved woman of the tribe. So she got high honors in her career and in her profession and in her community.
Well, certainly well deserved. All the
Oh,
the work that she did. Absolutely.
Yeah, she
Well,
also, and I know we have to go, but she inspired lots of other, when you talk to Cherokee nurses more our age, they knew and were inspired by Lula Gloin. So we had wonderful Ernestine Walking Stick, who has passed away, but there's a clinic named in her honor over in the Snowbird part. And several others were, Virginia Dixon, were inspired
that's great.
by, yeah, they, when you talk to them, although some are starting to pass away, they will say that it was Nurse Gloin and her starched white uniform and her professional manner and her caring heart that inspired them to go to nursing school. So there's that. And now there's, of course, way more, but
well, I'm so impressed with their advocacy for their patients and their population. You know, that's one thing, probably one of the first things I learned in nursing school was the need to be an advocate. And these women are great examples of the importance of advocacy for those that need our care. But since it's International Women's Day, Phoebe, was there anybody in the state who made an international impact that would be interesting to share with the audience?
Yeah, to me, she may be my most amazing, the nurse who amazes me the most was named Mary Mills. She's recently passed away too. She was from Wathaw, which is near Wallace, which is near about 40 miles from Wilmington inland. She was born in 1912. So you have a very rural African-American granddaughter of enslaved people. So she came from one-room schoolhouse, no indoor plumbing. So she came from as humble beginnings as you could probably have. Yet, in the middle of the Great Depression, she was able to enter Lincoln Hospital in Durham, North Carolina, which was there were really good African-American hospitals. Several, I would say, were outstanding, and Lincoln is one of those. So that's her schoolhouse. That's where Pender County is. But she graduated from Lincoln, and she had to have been really smart because she ended up, I don't know, I think we have a slide with all of her degrees. She ended up getting a bachelor's and master's in nursing. She got a certificate in public health nursing. She got in New York. She went to New York City and got a certificate in midwifery. She got a graduate certificate in healthcare administration. So for any of us, we would be super impressed with this. So she came back to North Carolina. Of course, she didn't have to with all those degrees. She could have practiced anywhere, but she came back to Northampton County, which is in the rural eastern part of the state, and practiced public health and taught midwife classes and did all the things that public health nurse, the things that both Claire Peck and Lula Gloin did. She went from home to home, providing care, giving shots, stitching, bandaging, teaching sanitation, teaching how to care for people with tuberculosis. There she is. Most births, particularly among African Americans before World War II, were home births in North Carolina, Black and white. And we had what people call granny midwives, which some of these women knew way more than I'll ever know, but didn't have often didn't have formal training or formal certification. So the public health nurses, all the public health nurses in North Carolina, part of their job description was to teach annual classes to granny midwives about how to care for pregnant women and newborns and labor and delivery. But then after World War II, the United States started the United States Public Health Service / International Health Branch, and she joined that. That's the U.S. Public Health Services, USPHS. So she was first sent to Liberia, to Monrovia, the capital city of Liberia. Her specialties, because of that certificate in nurse midwifery, were maternal child health. But in Liberia, she started a nursing school. She started the Franklin D. Roosevelt Hospital for Children, the first children's hospital, the first nursing program. She set up a lot of maternal child health clinics. She taught, again, sort of like Red Cross classes, a lot of local people how to better care for themselves. We can flip through a slide or two. So she spent 5 or 6 years in Liberia and was given the highest honor that they can give her. That last sentence, I don't want to get it wrong, the Knight Official of the Liberian Humane Order of African Redemption. At the time, the highest honor one could get, in a foreigner anyway, could get in Liberia. She came home I guess she got a 6-month leave for a rest, and she worked her way up. She finally became captain. She worked her way up through the ranks of, so they're like military ranks, even though it's a public health service. Her next stopping off point was Lebanon. And she did a lot of the same things, opened a nursing school. The nursing dorm there was named in her honor. I think it's been replaced more recently, but for a lot of years, it was the Mary Mills dorm. On her different ways around the world, she represented the United States at both the World Health Organization and the International Council of Nurses. I mean, again, imagine a young African-American impoverished girl from rural Eastern North Carolina representing our country at the World Health Organization and the International Council of Nurses. And she ended up being fluent in 5 languages. We don't have time to go country by country, but she went to Vietnam, Cambodia, Chad. Everywhere she went, she learned the language and did, learn the customs as best as anyone could. In Lebanon, she was awarded with the Order of the Cedars, which again is the highest honor you can get in Lebanon. So she spent 20 years providing nursing and midwifery services to really untold numbers of people. They did these, I haven't talked about this much, but they did smallpox and malaria eradication campaigns. Here in North Carolina, we had to do hookworm eradication campaigns and malaria earlier, but she took what we knew and helped all around the world. I think that's the Wilmington paper. They did a story about her upon her retirement. And not only did she get those international awards, but I won't read them all, but that's her with Governor Jim Hunt. Y'all remember Governor Hunt? He was the governor here in, I guess, the 90s. He was 4 terms, but she got a lot of degrees and awards, honorary degrees and awards from many different places. So as North Carolinians, we're really proud of her. She made us all look good.
Absolutely. She was amazing. Well, Sarah, I want to be sure we have a chance to answer the questions. Do we have time for one more question with Phoebe, or should we go ahead and open it up to Q&A?
You could talk about our last question. I think it's probably the largest one. So go ahead.
Okay, just want to be sure. Because it did strike me, Phoebe, as you were talking about the epidemics that some of these nurses lived through back then. And of course, I couldn't help but think about COVID, since we all just went through that. And if you had ever told me in nursing school I was going to be experiencing a pandemic, I would have said no way. And we went through quite an interesting journey in Greensboro. And the health system that I retired from actually opened up a COVID hospital so that we could house all the COVID patients. Because initially it was day-to-day understanding treatments and knowing what to do, counting supplies. It's quite overwhelming when COVID first started. And we would not allow visitors in the hospital. And it was truly all hands on deck. And I had the opportunity, to help out in the emergency room lobby, to help our emergency room staff, and did vaccine clinics. I had such a really good time doing that. But it was really a call to action as our nation had to address that, and as our state had to address that. And when you think about what we've been through with the COVID pandemic, what similarities, differences, anything that strikes you with the research that you've done when you think about what we've just lived through and how our the previous generations dealt with pandemics?
I think there's many more similarities than differences, actually. The two pandemics prior to COVID I'm most familiar with would have been the 1918 to 1920-21 flu. We think it actually started in Kansas, even though it's called the Spanish flu. We know it didn't start in Spain. And the polio epidemics that swept North Carolina and other parts of the country in the late 40s and early 50s. But the similarities to me are just what you said, all hands on deck. Emergency, in each case there was emergency hospital set up to deal with just that one specific disease. Isolation, people, now polio is not as transmissible as the flu, or either the COVID flu or the 18 flu, but still having to take much more careful precautions than usual in nursing, much more gowning and masking and gloving. Rushing nursing students in 1918, and even, you can tell, I really would like to hear you talk more about what happened with that, because I retired from teaching at Appalachian I was teaching all online in that spring of 20 and retired in June. I did go back when the vaccines came out. I went back to our health department, being a public health nurse, for a year, and gave shots and tests.
Yeah.
And I know, because I still have friends at App, but some of the nursing students were taking on more responsibility, and the hospitals were, because the need was so great, allowing, like last semester, seniors in some states to hurry with that. But we still we're not that different on pandemics. Of course, we got the vaccines. Now that created lots of problems. And the 1918, 1921 type flu.
Yeah, and we got the vaccines a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, but masking was very controversial 100 years ago too. Yeah, it was
amazing how things don't change sometimes, right?
I know, because it was still recommended by what was then like the Center for Disease Control. And some people were very diligent about masking, and some people wouldn't do it at all. And I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Isn't that the truth? I know, absolutely.
Yeah. I think,
well,
I want you to talk. Oh, be quiet.
No, I have said enough. I wanted to be sure it looks like we do have some Q&A, unless there's any other comment that you wanted to make, Phoebe.
Oh, no, let's do the questions first. I was just going to start going on about polio, but we can do that another day.
Sarah, we'll turn it over to you.
Yes, well, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. And that's only a small portion of all the research you've done so far, Dr. Pollitt. And if you're on this webinar, please go and check out her North Carolina nursing history website. It goes by county, and lots of research is on there to dive deeper into. Our first one was, what about hookworm issues?
Oh, you want to talk about hookworm?
Yeah.
I love hookworm. My favorite might be pellagra, but hookworm, in North Carolina, we exhausted our soil. Hookworm are little worms that live in the soil. And they're actually, then they get in our body usually through our feet. But we can also, what also happens is people don't have sanitary privies. People used to go to the bathroom. What's the right way to say that? just in the fields, in the forests, near their house, even without a privy. And if your privy wasn't very good, that was a problem too. So you could, you could step on feces that had hookworms that would get in you, or you could grow crops. If it was in your soil and then you grew crops and ate crops, you could ingest hookworms. But they were endemic in eastern North Carolina. They sap your energy. They take a lot of the good things that we need in digestion. They can get very long, but so people would get anemic, they would get tired. When you're anemic, after a while, your brain doesn't work as well. You're not getting as much oxygen. Anemia is when you don't have enough red blood cells, and red blood cells carry oxygen around your body. And you need to eat iron-rich foods, meats, leafy green vegetables. We do a little nutrition class here to get enough, to get the nutrients to make iron, to make red blood cells. But we had a lot of hookworm. We had a lot of pellagra, which is another nutritional deficiency disease. We had a lot of malaria, and those things you can keep going, but you go slower and you don't do as well. So Southerners got a terrible reputation, especially rural Southerners, had a terrible reputation that wasn't totally undeserved of being slow-witted, slow to move, lazy. And what it turned out, a lot of that was nutritional deficiencies and worms. And so the Rockefeller Foundation from New York came down. They're famous for eradicating hookworm around the world, but they did their first work here in eastern North Carolina. And there's a medicine called Thymol, Thymol, that apparently tasted just awful. It was super hard to get people to take it, but people would expel the worms in their feces. Can I say that on this webinar? And would get better relatively quickly. I mean, they could get reinfected, but they could take it again. Thymol was not hard to produce or very expensive, and they would give it out free. We had a really, really good public health department from the 18 something or others. We've just always been really blessed with good public health departments in North Carolina, the state Department of Public Health. So they worked with the Rockefeller Foundation and set up free dispense. I have photos and another PowerPoint. If anybody really cares, email me and I'll send you pictures of hookworm dispensaries. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it does.
But also, as we got better, as we got indoor plumbing, that probably helped more than anything else. Like with malaria, what really helped with malaria, which was screens, because they're carried by mosquitoes. And the malaria, I guess it's not a spirochete. I forget what exactly it is, what the organism is. But as soon as you can have screens, then you don't have as many mosquitoes, and you don't have as much malaria. So public health, just like these nurses, the way they got hospitals and got rest cottages and got sanitaria, a lot of nurses went way beyond what we think of as nursing and worked on sanitary privy campaigns and screen campaigns and pasteurized milk campaigns. So you don't think of that when you think of nurses necessarily, but those kinds of things did more to improve the public health or as much as medicines and hospitalization. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
Oh, no, that's amazing. And that's something that comes up here a lot in Greensboro. I know the Cones had their own dairy to help prevent different diseases affecting their workers. So it's a huge deal and really important to understanding nursing history, but also North Carolina health over the last couple of years. We also have another question. What about Gloria Hancock?
People want to know about Glory?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. She was, her real name was Madeline Battle. Her dad was Westray Battle, who I think he was actually from Florida, but came up here. We thought that tuberculosis could be cured by high altitude, by clean pine scented air. That was really the treatment of choice. My grandparents actually married in a TB sanatorium in Asheville. They thought he was on his deathbed, so they called my grandmother in and they got married. Then they couldn't cure him, so they sent him out to Boulder, Colorado. They thought higher, cleaner air would. Anyway, That's an aside. So Glory was the daughter of Westray Battle. Her dad was a doctor, and they were from a kind of highfalutin, wonderful Asheville family. So she went to nursing school in New York City, and then went early over to World War I. Started in Europe in 1914. We didn't enter till 18, but a lot of Americans went when the war started. So she went over quite early. She had in New York met a man named, well, his first name was Westray. I guess Westray Hancock. They ended up getting divorced. I think he beat her actually, but I don't know why I think that. I'd have to relook at my research. But she went over to Europe and was one of the first, and would send missives, letters, and when she'd come back for a period to visit her family, she would go on speaking tours. And she ended up being the most honored woman in all of World War I, any country, any career. So we have this woman, this nurse from Asheville, North Carolina, who she got Orders of the Cross kind of medals. You can see her medals from France and Belgium. I'm sure the US. I'm not sure about England, but from many countries, she was honored and awarded. She stayed in Europe after the war, as a lot of American nurses did. She helped with orphans in France and women and children in France, because I guess the European countries were really devastated, and died over there in 1931, right around the early 30s.
Wow.
I have stuff about her on my website if you want to go there.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to talk to you more. So you have your website that is hosted by App State's nursing department that has extensive research on nursing history for North Carolina. And I know you're still doing research on nursing history. What are you currently working on and in the next couple of years?
Two things right now. The North Carolina Nurse Association has asked me, the American Nurse Association is doing a deep dive into racial reconciliation right now, which is really wonderful. And my good friend, Pat D'Antonio, who's like the amazing, most noticed nursing historian in the country, at University of Pennsylvania, just wrote a big, important, wonderful paper for the American Nurse Association. So the North Carolina Nurse Association people called me a few weeks ago, a month ago, and asked if I would write a similar thing on a state level. So it's looking at racism in the organization. And I always try and write, yay, nurses, aren't these wonderful women? Aren't these amazing? Because they are, there's so many amazing stories. But they said, don't sugarcoat it, tell it like it is. And so, we do have the Nurse Association has a checkered past. It's done lots of wonderful things, but in terms of race, not so wonderful. So I'm writing that. It'll be in the Tar Heel Nurse in 3 sections. There'll be a spring, summer, and fall. And then at the convention next fall, there'll be a sessions devoted to an action plan looking at racial reconciliation. The second thing I'm working on right now is sort of by hook and crook. Turns out Watauga County, where this little county up here in the mountains, was the site of a 3-year birth control study in the late 30s, a national birth control study of foams and jellies and diaphragm. This was way before the pill or IUDs. And turns out, we all think, listen to me, it's sort of a common thought that a lot of medical research was done on African Americans and then in like third world countries. That's all true, like the Tuskegee study. But it turns out white Appalachian people were also medical guinea pigs. And so a lot of the early birth control on jelly and foam and sponges was done in Kentucky, in the mountains of Kentucky and North Carolina. So I didn't know, you learn new stuff every day. But I'm kind of interested just because it's like in my hometown, and I'm interested in women's health. So I'm looking into that right now as well.
Well, thank you so much. We're coming up to the end of our time. I wish we had so much more because you have so much interesting history to tell us. So thank you, Phoebe and Anne, for coming on today. We are so excited to have you.
Sarah, can I look at the questions and individually email people back if they're, I didn't know if I could or couldn't.
Well, those are the main.
Okay. It just says 4 on my screen. It says 4 questions.
Yes, so they were the two main ones, and then the
Oh,
other one
okay.
was just telling us that her mom worked in Guilford County Health Department
Oh,
as a nurse,
nice.
and she was a TB tracer. So
Oh, yeah. We
yeah,
had to watch them swap. Yeah, when I was a young public health nurse, people would come in and they'd get the INH, but we had to give it to them. We had to watch them swallow.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, we had to find them. When I was a school nurse, we had a bus driver that had TB, so we had to test all the youngins on her bus for just, oh gosh. Yeah, it's not over yet. I mean, it's mostly over, but tuberculosis. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much for today. Stick around for more women's history at the Greensboro History Museum this weekend. We have two awesome programs that will be taking place. We have our Lifted Voices Women's History that will be from 12 to 2 this Saturday with costume interpreters throughout the museum. We'll have Laura Cohn, Josephine Boyd Bradley, Willa B. Player, all these amazing women from Greensboro and North Carolina history that will be portraying this weekend and celebrating. Also, we'll have Little Lions at 2 p.m. with snacks, selfies, and suffragettes. So we're diving deeper into the 1920s and the rights for women's voting. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. And then in April, we will have our Gerrymandering Madness Night on April 6th. You can find out more information at greensborohistory.org/events to learn more. Again, thank you for coming out today, and continue following us as we have more events happening throughout the month. Thank you.